You can choose your friends but not your neighbors. Start off with Pakistan. There's always a problem in Pakistan. Since Uri and Pulwama, there have been no major terror attacks. And I would think that is a considerable achievement of this government. Perhaps because of the fear of punishment, but that doesn't prevent them from trying to harm India.
You are on Strat News Global, and this program is Strat Talk, once a month long format discussion with specialists in their subjects. And today we thought we will talk about what's happening in India's immediate neighborhood. Of course, India's neighborhood can be extended neighborhood right up to Iran and Israel on the west, and maybe even Far East to the east. But today we are trying to confine ourselves to the Indian subcontinent mainly, and to talk about or discuss how does the subcontinent look at the moment as far as relationships between India and the other countries is with me Yash Sinha, former High Commissioner to UK, High Commissioner to Sri Lanka, also seasoned diplomat and someone who has also worked on Pakistan, Iran, Afghanistan as a JS, was a counselor in Pakistan, and generally a keen observer of what's happening in the neighborhood. So Yash, welcome to this program.
Thank you, Nitin. Thank you for having me in this very new format for me.
Well, actually the same format, but in a little different setting. And like I said, we are looking at the neighborhood given multiple events that have happened in the past 6 months in our neighborhood, from Nepal to Bangladesh to Sri Lanka. Prime Minister has just come back from Sri Lanka. He was also in Thailand in BIMSTEC summit, which is also can be called, I call BIMSTEC SAARC minus Pakistan. So I'm sure you'll have opinion on that. But just give us an overview. What do you think is happening in India's neighborhood?
Well, I mean, that is something that, first I want to start by quoting Prime Minister Vajpayee. You can choose your friends but not your neighbors. And it's very important. Of course, some military people might disagree with me on that, but I think given the geopolitics, I think it's a very prescient, very apt statement, remark that he had made, because we live in India, we live in a tumultuous neighborhood. And if I may, you have Pakistan and Afghanistan in the northwest, you have China, Nepal and Bhutan to our north, and then we have Myanmar and Bangladesh to our east. And then in the south, we have two islands, Sri Lanka and Maldives. Now, in not all, but in most of these countries in our neighborhood, there are issues, not just bilateral issues, but issues within those countries. The hardy perennials are Pakistan and Afghanistan. Start off with Pakistan. There's always a problem in Pakistan, and there continues to be one. The most popular leader in Pakistan is in jail, and the army continues to call the shots. It's the same old story, played out differently through the decades. So I think with Pakistan we have a problem. We know we know what the problem is, but the important thing is that since this government has been in power, or at least since Uri and Pulwama, there have been no major terror attacks. And I would think that is a considerable achievement of this government. Perhaps because of the fear of punishment or retaliation, perhaps. But the fact is, and maybe they're too preoccupied also, but that doesn't prevent them from trying to harm India. And you see what they're trying to do in Bangladesh. So we can elaborate on that later. Afghanistan, of course, their problems are internal, really, with the ISAF and the NATO basically leaving, if I may say so, with their tail between their legs. And we've had a Taliban redux, Taliban 2.0, which harks back to a lot of the policies that they believe in. Their ideology doesn't change. But the only silver lining is that this time they are not so inimically disposed towards India as they were earlier. When they were earlier in power, I was in Pakistan, so I knew what happened. We observed it closely. And I think that, again, credit to this government, because they've managed to keep the lines of communication open at whatever level. Sure. The last, I think, meeting was with the Foreign Secretary Vikram Misri in Dubai,
right,
with their acting Foreign Minister Mutakil. I'm glad we've kept those lines of communication open. I think perhaps we need to do more, but we'll come to that later. China, I will give a pass because
Yes.
they're experts in China, which I'm not. But Nepal, I go to Nepal. Again, Nepal, we have a case of musical chairs where the prime ministers keep changing. And an added factor recently is the pro-monarchy movement with King Gyanendra surfacing, if I can put it that way. And that will pose a challenge to the current government, the coalition government in Nepal. And how that plays out in terms of relations with India would be interesting to see. I understand that one of the leaders was caught in Assam recently and handed back to Nepal. But I think we need to keep a close watch. There is instability there also. And I'm trying to draw this arc of instability around. Myanmar, I think we all know what's happening in Myanmar, and extremely unfortunate. But again, the possibility of spilling over into India. We already have a problem in Manipur, and there is obviously an impact of what happens in the borders there with Myanmar. Bangladesh is something that I didn't anticipate, I must confess. What happened in August last year, perhaps, I'm sure our High Commissioner, others knew or anticipated that something might happen. But to me personally, it came as a bit of a surprise because I thought Sheikh Hasina was in firm control, but obviously not. And there were forces arrayed against her, which obviously played a role in ensuring that she was removed from the scene. And then the interim government, I mean, I find that term quite interesting, chief advisor in interim government. I mean, I've talked to some of my Bangladeshi friends, and I don't see any constitutional justification for this arrangement, but then, everything is possible, in our part of the world. And I won't say in our neighbourhood, but yes, in our part of the world. Bhutan being the honourable exception, of course, Bhutan is peaceful, the relations with India very good. Of course, we are observing keenly what they're up to as far as China is concerned, but that's a different issue. And that certainly impacts on us also in terms of our security. But otherwise, I think we have excellent relations with Bhutan. I've covered Myanmar and Bangladesh. Now, Sri Lanka. Sri Lanka. Sri Lanka is something that, when the Araglia protests happened, it was a perfect storm. I had described it. I think I wrote an article somewhere on this whole Araglia protests and the crisis that erupted, economic crisis. And I termed it the perfect storm because you had a combination of factors that came into play, starting with the April Easter bombings in 2019, financial and governance problems, maladministration. You had an army person in charge, and mind you, my father in the army, I think they make excellent administrators, but this particular gentleman, whom I know well, was a very good administrator in terms of urban development in Colombo, but for the entire country, I think they was probably misguided. It led to a huge economic crisis there. And then tourism dried up because of the Easter bombings and the economic crisis that...
And COVID, of course.
And COVID was COVID also resulted in a steep drop in tourism. But I think that led to the perfect storm, and in March 2022, the scenes unplayed in quite unbelievable on our televisions at the Golf Face, in the President's Secretariat, the Presidential Palace, Temple Trees, all of them were stormed by people. It was a citizens' protest. It was, as spontaneous. I'm not sure whether it was completely spontaneous or not, but I think the anger was palpable.
Sure.
So I think that led to its own problem, the economic crisis. But here I'd like to say a word about what India did. Because in our neighborhood, we're always painted out to be the big bully. But what we did for Sri Lanka was exceptional. $4.5 billion of assistance, medicines, food items, oil, petroleum products, you name it, and nobody else stepped up. We were the people stepping up. Even during COVID, we provide vaccines and other oxygen, etc. So this was, in my opinion, a game changer.
Yes.
Really, because the perception of India changed. And I went back twice after the protests, and after once for a law conference. I was wearing the hat of CIC then.
Oh, yes.
And I was invited to a law conference in Norelia, and I saw the country limping back. This was in June 2023. But I went back 2 weeks ago, 3 weeks ago, a week before the Prime Minister landed, and I was pleasantly surprised to see that the country had made some amount of progress. There is still a long way to go, but there was stability
Right.
in terms of the policies being followed, in terms of the new government's commitment to the IMF, program. So I think that was heartening news. And the icing on the cake, of course, was the Prime Minister's visit, which was, again, in my opinion, a game changer. But we can come to that later.
Sure.
And how it worked with the agreements signed. Some of the agreements signed, in my opinion, two agreements that I found quite, how to say, interesting, and for lack of a better word. One is the defense cooperation
Yeah, exactly.
agreement.
It's
It
been
made-
tried for a long time.
Yes. And recently I was listening to a podcast where some of the hardliners on the other side were a bit upset that this was done. But for AKD President Dissanayake to do it, I think was a bold step, and in my opinion, a correct step. It was formalizing what already existed to a large extent and more.
Sure.
I don't have the fine print, so I don't know exactly.
Anything has come out on that.
Exactly. And the other is the tripartite agreement with UAE on development of Trincomalee as an energy hub. We've been trying that for so many years. And the tank farm agreements were signed in 2003, 2004. And again, it was formalized in 2022. But the problem is the honoring those agreements, or these MOUs. So I am keeping my fingers crossed. I hope this will be a sea change in our relationship, take it to the next level. As far as Maldives is concerned, I can only think of one phrase: strategic patience.
Correct.
And I think what India did, despite the India Out campaign and President Muzu coming to power, the initial signals were very mixed. But India showed strategic patience and turned things around. Now, obviously, it's not a one-size-fits-all. I mean, some people say you should do that in Bangladesh. I'm not sure that will work.
No.
But it certainly did work in Maldives and in Sri Lanka also to some extent. And I think hopefully we will see the benefits as time goes by. But I'll stop here because I've given you a rather detailed
It's a very
tour
good,
de force of
it's a
the
good point to
subcontinent.
start our conversation. And Surya, if I can ask you,
What is your reading of China's penetration of our region? We hear all these alarming stories, but we seem to be holding our own. How do you read it?
That's a very interesting question because I remember a decade ago or even more, when we spoke about the string of pearls, people didn't believe us. People thought that we were exaggerating the threat that came there. But those of us on the ground knew what was happening even then. And what China has been able to do because of its deep pockets and, of course, cultivating the elites in these countries in a way that we cannot. We are a democracy and we cannot go beyond a point. And I know what they did in Sri Lanka. Personally, I saw it myself. Now, we are unable to match them in terms of the funds available to them and some of the methods that they use to co-opt the elites, the governing elites in those countries. So I think it was obviously not philanthropic. The purpose was quite clear: to keep India hemmed in and within the region, South Asia, not really challenge. We're not challenging anybody, but basically to keep us boxed in the region. And our neighbors are very adept at playing India versus a third country, a extraterritorial country outside the region. Earlier it was the United States and the West, and now it's China. So we are aware of that, but we continue to try and have our own bilateral sort of synergies with these countries, sometimes successfully, sometimes not so successfully, and for various reasons. But I think we need to be mindful of what China is up to. I know in 2015 things turned around in Sri Lanka, but then things can always change because we need to have a relationship with our neighbors irrespective of which government is in power. I think we've done that to some extent successfully in Maldives, and I hope we can do it elsewhere too, because I think the way India has grown in the last decade or even last 2 decades, but certainly in the last decade, I think people have realized that not only is India the first responder in terms of assistance, whether it's the tsunami or whether it's COVID, but also because the economy. I mean, by plugging into the 4th, 5th largest economy about to become the third largest economy in the world, there are benefits. And I think our neighbors realize those benefits. Of course, Pakistan is sui generis, so I will not talk about Pakistan. But the Chinese penetration in our neighborhood is, I would say, quite deep. In some countries, more than others. But I think we are up to the challenge in terms of promoting our own interests, not necessarily blocking China, but giving our neighbors an alternative. But for instance, our development cooperation program, most of our projects are based on needs expressed by the local government, whether at the center or the provinces or at the local grassroots level. So all our projects, most of our projects at least, we don't dictate the projects that we want to do. Unlike China and some other countries who want to develop a particular project for their own ulterior motives. So people see that difference and see the benefits. We don't build a Lotus Star, for instance, but we do build 50,000 houses in Sri Lanka. And I've seen for myself, in fact, I don't know if you're aware that India, that program was nominated for the World Habitat Award in 2015-16.
Yeah.
But because these actually benefit the people at the grassroots level. Our high-impact development projects, the quick gestation projects in Afghanistan, I saw, they made a huge difference to the lives of widows, people, displaced families, etc., in Sri Lanka too. So I think our model is different. So if we are able to portray or put forward another alternative model of development to our neighbors, and they realize how we are not interested in enslaving them in debt. Because, what happened in Sri Lanka, the economic crisis was partly because of the huge debt that they had, just commercial domestic debt and external debt too. And China was the main country that they owed money to. So I think people have realized that there is an issue where there's the BRI. They're probably not able to articulate and openly. But this time when I went to Sri Lanka, I realized that they're very wary of projects that are being offered by China and others. In our case, I was told that we converted $100 million of soft loans to grants in the last few months, which again, we're being extremely generous. So I think that is, the way to forward, in my opinion. And we really need to get the people invested in better ties with India. And for that, I think we need to do our homework, and I think our public outreach needs to be strengthened.
Absolutely. No, I think that's the model that you're talking about. That's a huge difference. People realize it, you're sure. But Brigadier Chatterjee, maybe you have a question on Bangladesh? I don't know.
No, not in Bangladesh. Actually, it's very much related to what you were talking right now, that you get the people invested. See, but I am at least not aware, I'm not from the Foreign Service, more a military man. I'm not aware that we really undertake focused programs at what we call as information operations in the army, what you will possibly call as public diplomacy in your offices. Do we really undertake these programs to influence public opinion? Because like you said, China buys the elite. We are interested in buying the masses, because that mass will ultimately decide who's going to be the elite through the elections. And most of these countries, a lot of these countries, at least our neighborhood, are otherwise democracies. So what is the kind of influence operations that you really try and run in this country? Then it's organized. As much as I know, Indian Information Service officers really don't go to our embassies, as much as I'm aware. I thought they were the executioners of these information operations, where you should be giving them the basic theme to propagate, and thereafter it's their business.
No, it's a very good question, because that's something that we should be doing, and I'm sure we have a long way to go to in terms of public diplomacy in our neighborhood. But we have made a very good beginning, and I'll confine myself only to Sri Lanka, because that's where I was involved. Now, as far as India is concerned, with each of our neighbors, we have these special links, historical, civilizational links, which, for whatever reason, will never, I wouldn't say never, but was not really sort of put forward in terms of, we had the Buddhist relics coming, the relics of Lord Buddha coming. Of course, that was a big thing. It's happened periodically in Sri Lanka. It has happened. So I think these are important links, but someone needs to articulate these links very clearly, and not just in English, as we do, but also in the local vernacular languages. So a strategy that I followed was two-track. One was I would constantly emphasize, and I had this advantage coming from Bihar, and my father was born in Gaya. So I would highlight that, and people would just listen then. And I talk about Patliputra and Ashok, and I talk about Mahendra, as we call him in India, Mahendra there, and Sanghamitra, and how Sanghamitra came with the sapling of the Bodhi tree, and how that Bodhi tree survives in Anuradhapura. The original was cut down in the 12th century AD, and it was replanted from a sapling from Anuradhapura. So, I would always use that as a public diplomacy tool. It was a connect. It was a heart-to-heart conversation. I'd try and sort of reach out to the radio, for instance. That was still very popular then, in English, unfortunately, but then try and get translations done if possible. The other track that I followed was our development cooperation. Our development cooperation was extensive in Sri Lanka. It's over $7 billion, or almost $8 billion now. When I was there, it was slightly less than $4 billion. But projects all over the island. So we had programs in Sinhalese, in Tamil, and of course English. Apart from the print media, reach out, television, on radio, etc. And I would encourage colleagues to go out and talk, universities, students, groups, etc. We had a Center for Contemporary Indian Studies in Colombo University. I'd used that platform to reach out to the academia. Now, how successful I was, only time will tell. But I think I was quite okay, because when I was leaving Sri Lanka, I left in 2016. The holiest day in the Sinhala Buddhist calendar, in fact, any Buddhist calendar, is the Vesak, or the Buddha Purnima. But in the Sinhala calendar, the second holiest day is the Poson Poya. Poson Poya is a full moon. A Poya is a full moon. Poson Poya it commemorates the day Mahinda converted King Devanam Piyatissa to Buddhism. He was on a hunting expedition, and this is near Anuradhapura, a place called Mehentale. So perhaps for the first time, and I'm not sure whether anyone else has ever been invited, I was the first foreign envoy to be invited to speak on that occasion, on that day, near the rock, with the President of Sri Lanka.
Wow.
Now, because recognizing the efforts that I was making, trying to connect the two countries, I thought, in my opinion, I think one of the most successful moments for me personally in public diplomacy. Sure. And I didn't speak Sinhala, but there was a gathering, people were translating. And I only spoke for 5 minutes, but I highlighted these connections. I think with each of our neighbors, we have similar stories. So I think we really need to highlight that. We can't live in the past, certainly, but that link that needs to be maintained and needs to be highlighted more than maintained, because a lot of people either don't know or they forget. In the neighborhood. So whether in Nepal, you have Janakpur, and you have so many other links, Lumbini, etc., which we need. And you're for the army, look at Gurkha officers. I personally feel we need to use our Gurkha officers in public diplomacy, because they speak the language better sometimes than their own mother tongue. They are our best ambassadors, because they go and trek in that region, in the mountains, etc. I think we need to use them. I'm sure we are. I don't know, because I've never served in Nepal.
We do.
But I think we need to look at the connections with each and every country that in our neighborhood, and see where we can, sort of get on to to catch the pulse of the people, really. I think Bollywood, I was speaking, is a huge hit, not just in our neighborhood, but all over the world. Whether it's Uzbekistan or Russia, or whether it's Egypt. My first posting in Egypt, when I was learning Arabic, in a shared taxi, I was asked to translate a song, Bol Radha, Bol Sangam Hoga Kini. Now, this is the power, the soft power that India has, which we need to exploit. And I'm sure we're doing it. But coming back to our neighborhood, while we may not be functioning as systematically as the army or the services in terms of an info operation, but certainly we are reaching out at various levels. And that's paying dividends because, our aid certainly does help, but when there is an emotional connect, then we talked about, for instance, the Buddhist circuit and the Ramayan trail. Now, successive governments in Sri Lanka have been trying to promote that. And we should encourage it because the land bridge is something that is very contentious because the Sri Lankans feel that, but we try and explain to them, and it'll take time, how Sri Lanka will benefit. One way, I know the monks were telling me that they'd be able to catch a train from Colombo right up to Bodh Gaya. Of course, they'll have to change on the way. As long as that ferry service between Talai Manar and Rameshwaram is restored, which the Prime Minister, when he went, also we are aiming, he went there, he flew over the Adams Bridge and Ram Setu. So I think there are various levels that we need to do. We're already doing it. Perhaps we need to strengthen it, make it more systematic. But I agree with you. If we don't do that, then it's very difficult to reach out to the masses.
Sure. Actually, that's a good point to take a break on. We are in a conversation with Yash Sinha, seasoned diplomat on India's neighborhood and what's happening here. Don't go away. I'll be back soon.
The Arc of Power, a never-before-documented comprehensive series from India's Andaman and Nicobar Command, ANC, highlights the critical significance of the tri-service fortress islands, which some call the country's unsinkable aircraft carriers. We explore its strategic depth from remote islands to vital maritime choke points and witness the command's vigilance securing India's interests against rising regional challenges. In Part 1, the Indian Navy, Army, Air Force and Coast Guard in joint exercises off and on Rutland Island.
Welcome back. We are in conversation with Yash Sinha, seasoned diplomat, who's speaking to us on how India looks at the neighborhood and how India is at the moment in terms of relationships with all these countries. And my colleagues, all the editors here, we've done the first half. In the second half, probably we'll concentrate on countries like Nepal, look at also partly Afghanistan and Bangladesh. So, Ram, if you want to ask him something on Bangladesh.
I think I'll just skip to Sri Lanka, if I may.
Okay.
Because we just had a columnist from Sri Lanka. He's the head of the Lanka India Business Revolution or something. And he had made an interesting point that while the Prime Minister's visit was very good on optics, there was no clear economic agenda. And he said that might have been deliberate because, Sri Lanka has local elections coming up. There's a dual legacy of, anti-India thing. But he also said that what they were looking for was a zero tariff regime. And some ridiculous laws which say that, when we are importing socks from them, from a pair of socks, each sock is seen as one item. So if you're saying 1 million socks, we'll actually allow only 1,000 socks from them. How valid is that assumption?
This is news to me about the socks. I find it difficult to believe, but then our mandarins in the Commerce Ministry would know better. But there are problems. And the problems are partly of our own making, because we are too rigid, and partly of their making also, Sri Lanka. So when I was there, I'd hear a complaint when we were talking about ECTA, the Technology Cooperation Agreement, which was basically CEPA by another name, ran into problems simply because the Sri Lankan business, some of them would come to me and tell me that, you have non-tariff barriers on our exports. And I said, like what? Because we allow, he said, well, simple thing, pepper. Now, pepper is something which Sri Lanka produces and exports. But we had, under the FTA, it was allowed in freely, but our own lobbies ensured that there were barriers put up. When the SAFTA came into play, again, there was no duty, nothing on they could come in, but they started putting in formal quotas. So that, unfortunately, that's just one. I don't know about the socks, but certainly pepper was a problem during my time. We need to be far more generous with that. We're already very generous, but in terms of, like with Bangladesh, we were very generous. We could perhaps do the same with Sri Lanka. It really won't cost us that much. And mind you, it's not just India being generous to Sri Lanka. The Sri Lanka sees a business opportunity. Do you know that the largest investment from our neighborhood, and that was true a few years ago, I think it still holds true, is from Sri Lanka in Vizag.
Yeah.
The Brandix, employs women, and mainly from the backward areas. It's a huge income generator there in that part of India, and it benefits Sri Lanka obviously because they use that to supply countries in the West. I don't know about the Trump tariffs, how that will play out.
We don't know.
But
He's doing very well.
Similarly, Mas, Hyderabadi Group, they all have, investments in India. So I think we have to be slightly more generous. We have to be careful. I remember during my time, we had areca nut coming in from Sri Lanka, which was not Sri Lankan. The country of origin was, if I remember correctly, Indonesia or some other country in the region. Now, obviously, China can also misuse FTAs which we have with our neighbors. And Sri Lanka is one of our first FTAs. So I think we need to reassure them that our intention is not to block. In certain areas, for instance, tea and textiles, they are competitors. But they are a very small economy. I mean, for instance, talking about tariffs, Harley-Davidsons. I'm personally I'd advocate there should be 0% duty on Harley-Davidson. It should have been announced many months ago. Why? How many would sell? Look at the price. Maybe 10,000, even less, 5,000, 4,000. That wouldn't be a drop in the ocean as far as Indian manufacturers are concerned. Similarly, with our neighbors, we need to be generous. We don't need to be overly generous, and we must ensure that the rules of country of origin rules are respected. But we can afford to be generous, especially when our economy is doing well compared to them. So I think there are some genuine fears, but I think a lot of it is exaggerated. And I think in negotiations, when you get into serious negotiations, if it's done in good faith, and ultimately it has to be a political decision when you go in for an FTA or a CEPA. And I think with the current level of cooperation, trust between the two governments, I'm talking about Sri Lanka only, I think we can easily bridge that gap.
So
it should not be difficult.
On that note, let me ask you this. This is a common refrain I hear in the West, or even sometimes in our own discourse amongst think tanks, that geographically there may be problems of this region. Indian subcontinent was divided. There are suspicions all around. But even economically, it is not. It's the least integrated region if you compare it to the EU or if you compare it to the North Americans. Although everything is now appended, that's a different issue. But would you agree, if you look at the larger picture, not just Sri Lanka or say Nepal, but Bangladesh, even Myanmar, there are hardly any economic linkages in that sense?
I think SARC was an excellent initiative. Sure. Unfortunately, it's moribund because of a political problem, because of one country, really.
Correct.
Because they insist on bringing bilateral issues, and which basically stymies cooperation. And the other countries feel it becomes an India-Pakistan show, and that is why it hasn't progressed at all. And I think, personally, I feel Pakistan has a huge opportunity as the next host of the summit to take an initiative to ensure that all the countries come together. But for that, they need to first
get their own act right.
together. They need to get their own act together and then proceed. But SARC, you're right. South Asia is one of the least integrated regions in the world. And the reasons we've already mentioned. We have done a bit regionally. You mentioned BIMSTEC, but some of these agree BBIN. So we did try to do things.
Right.
For instance, what we rescinded with Bangladesh recently was a great initiative as far as Bangladesh was concerned. Right. They could use our ports for transshipment, exports to the West. So electricity, again, connectivity, our grids with Bhutan has been so successful for both countries. It's a win-win. For Nepal, hopefully, it will move in that direction.
starting with
And
45,
similarly, Sri Lanka.
Yeah. They're from south, it's now
Because
from Sampur.
grid connectivity, they signed an agreement on power connectivity, but that's been on the table for the last 20 years.
Right.
And it hasn't progressed. I'm glad that the Prime Minister virtually sort of launched that solar powers. But can you imagine it's a 125 megawatt project? 10 years ago, it was a 500 megawatt project, 2 into 250 megawatts thermal power. But then, for whatever reason, I mean, they said environment, perhaps, but I know that there were other reasons too, that project was cancelled. And that has affected Sri Lanka because they've had blackouts, because they rely mainly on the Chinese built North Cholai power project, which uses dirty coal.
Right.
And it is very inefficient.
Absolutely.
And a constant breakdown. So I think power sector, energy, I mean, by energy I include everything, electricity and
Solar.
wind, solar. We can do so much, and I think Sri Lanka realizes that.
Yes.
Especially during the economic crisis that they had, we were supplying them petroleum products. Sri Lanka, IOC is there, we have the tank farms.
Right.
So this agreement with UAE that I referred to was the trilateral agreement. Be very interesting how they transform Trincomalee into an energy hub. And of course, Trincomalee is the second deepest natural harbor in the world after Sydney.
Correct.
And it's a shame that the British recognize that. They built the tank farms. You know that there were 100 tank farms.
Now
they're 99 because a kamikaze pilot in World War II
The
crashed.
Japanese
into one.
fellow.
But we have an agreement with the Ceylon Petroleum Corporation, and I hope that progresses because there's tremendous potential.
Economic integration is actually the way forward if you look at that.
That's right. And in the East Coast, there's hardly anything happened.
That's right.
It's even tourism. The best beaches in Sri Lanka
Vatikolo
and Pasikoda
Yeah.
and Vatikara, the best beaches are there.
Exactly.
So I think there's a lot of potential, and India and Sri Lanka can work together. But electricity, energy is one
Sure.
connector throughout the region, which can bring countries together.
Absolutely, we'll do that. I'll come to Ravi at the end, but Ketki, any question?
I'm curious how you look at what's happening in Nepal. We have the king who had agreed that there will be no political views coming in. He's now made his way from Pokhara to Kathmandu. Even though the video may not have been political, everybody knew what it meant. So how do you see what's happening in Nepal? How seriously do you think the pro-monarchy demonstrations are?
There's always been support for the monarchy. The monarchy did get discredited, especially when they were the royal family, when there was the assassinations, unfortunate assassinations that took place. And then even during King Gyanin's time when he was ruling, obviously that's when the communists came, the Maoists, etc. They coalesced and then overthrew the monarchy. So there has been a history as far as the monarchy is concerned, but then it's cyclical. I see it as cyclical because the alternative that came, parliamentary democracy and the coalitions that happened subsequently, I think people are also a bit fed up of the musical chairs that happen, the prime minister, one coalition, then one party, etc. And that affects governance. And when that affects governance, the common man, it becomes bread and butter issues for them. So I think the monarchy or the king is now trying to find space for himself or his followers. Whether that leads to a political change or a political, I don't know. It's too early to say. But certainly there is a body of opinion in Nepal that harks back to the days of the monarchy, and they try and support something. And the reason for that is because it's fertile ground, because of,
The shenanigans of the politicians.
exactly, and not governance issues.
Exactly.
So, well, I won't want to hazard a guess, but I think in a democracy, everybody is allowed. The king might decide to become a politician. Who knows? I don't know about that, but anybody in this family, royal family, the Nepali citizen can contest elections, form a party, etc. So I don't know how that will go, but there is certainly some support for the monarchy.
That sentiment is nascent at the moment, but it can just, surge if one goes forward, and if the misgovernance issues continue there in Nepal. But certainly, Ravi,
Yeah, I just add up timing. Tell us about the timing. Why it is happening now? Why?
Nepal.
Yeah, the disturbances and the bring back monarchy there, and
movement.
the politicians in Nepal, in fact, saying that it is coming from the India is fomenting trouble to.
I think that's
I think India is the bogeyman.
Yeah, bogey.
India is the bogeyman. Wherever anything goes wrong, India is to blame. But I can't answer that question
Know
in
about the
terms.
timings.
The only answer I have to that is that there
What has
been,
happened? Some
there's been an accumulation of, issues, maladministration, corruption, etc., which is all coalesced into, I won't say public anger, but certainly public resentment. And that happened in Araglia, for instance, in Sri Lanka. Now, I'm not saying anything similar will happen in Nepal, probably not. But the fact is, when something new enters, it's not new really in this case, but a dormant sort of institution like the monarchy suddenly comes into play, the reason has to be some
so
dissatisfaction.
analogy is that Sri Lanka happened first, then Bangladesh, now Nepal.
But then,
what is happening?
but then I hope you're not blaming India. India had nothing to do with any of those.
No, it could be even extra regional power.
No, I know in Bangladesh, for instance, it's quite clear who played, I mean, becoming apparent now, and who played a role. And so I think Nepal may be different, completely different. The timing obviously had nothing to do with India. The timing is perhaps something to do with their own internal politics and their own sort of governance issues. People getting fed up of the same. Like in Nepal, Sri Lanka, people were fed up of the old ancien regime and they wanted a change. And AKD came to power because of that solid vote for change.
Absolutely.
Now, what happens in Nepal, I can't predict.
I want to ask one question on Pakistan. So recently, there was a lot of disturbances at LOC and recently. So the trouble is coming from across the border. It's very apparent. But on diplomatic level, what is the story in future for India-Pakistan relationship? How do you read it now?
It's a very sterile relationship at present, and simply because Pakistan must realize that unless they give up support for terrorism, there is no appetite in India. And I'm not just talking about the government, I'm talking about the people.
General public also is fed up.
The public opinion is, for instance, we didn't go for the Champions Trophy. I was personally hoping that our team would go because I'm a cricket fan and I'd like to see India play Pakistan, and I've seen matches there when I was serving there in Pakistan. But the environment was not propitious. The statements emanating out of it, if they really wanted the Indian team to come, they should have traveled that extra mile to reassure us, not just in terms of security, but in not mixing politics, not getting in, for instance, turning off the faucet of terrorism. That is something they find very difficult to do, and they don't want to do it, obviously. They can tone it down a bit whenever they want to, but then they ratchet it up whenever they feel like. So I think we need to be prepared. As far as Pakistan is concerned, we must learn, and we have learned, to manage the relationship as best as we can. It will always be an irritant, and as it faces its own internal problems, it becomes less, in my opinion, of a threat to us. But sometimes when things become out of hand, rulers like to adopt an adventurous course of action. I hope Pakistan doesn't make that mistake, because they should realize the differential.
Also, because it has been a decade now, the stalemate goes on, and nothing can.
What the government, from what you're saying, government is also going by the public mood, that there is no appetite. And now that China has become India's primary adversary, Pakistan has sort of got sidelined in terms of the mind space for any discussion with Pakistan, I suppose.
But militarily, we have to factor in the two.
That, yes.
So that is, of course, a different thing entirely.
Correct.
But I don't think we've completely closed the door to dialogue. If you remember, the External Affairs Minister Jaishankar had gone
Yes.
there, and that was a big gesture that we had made. Of course, Bilawal had come earlier to Goa, but that was a very sterile. It was counterproductive. Because he was grandstanding.
SCO.
And that was SCO, and he was grandstanding. Dr. Jaishankar was very careful. And he did absolutely everything as per protocol. But it was a gesture. And there was talk about then India sending a team for the Champions Trophy there. But that didn't materialize because there was things that Pakistan not only did not do, but they aggravated the situation.
That's true.
By their statements, by some of their actions. So I think I would personally be very happy if the two countries talk to each other, the governments talk to each other. It's always good to have a dialogue, but it cannot be an unconditional dialogue. I mean, it has to be based on certain benchmarks, parameters, especially since we've dealt with Pakistan for so long. We know what they're capable of, what they do. So it's very difficult to take them at their word. So as I think Reagan said, trust but verify.
Yes, exactly. So Ram, you had a question.
That, I'll ask a generic question. Sometimes I've heard diplomats say that, look, when it comes to our neighbors, their politicians come to us asking us to engage. But when we do engage, we're accused of interference, which means that, even if they're doing something altruistic, we need to be careful because it will be seen as, interference. How difficult does that make things for us?
And just link to that, link to what he's saying. Would you say that leaving aside Pakistan, the relationship with Nepal is among the most contested compared to some of the other neighbors?
I would say Bangladesh right now, but no, I think to get back to your question, I think it's always a challenge because our job is to reach out to all shades of opinion, even those that are against us. Even in Pakistan, we did try to reach out to some of these Islamic parties who were not favorably disposed towards us. And sometimes in private conversations, they were very normal. But their public posturing was different.
Their compulsions are different.
Exactly. So we must recognize that. Similarly, with our other neighbors, there are parties who, for the JVP in Sri Lanka. Now, when I was in Sri Lanka, we did, in fact, but I won't name the gentleman who's a minister now. He told me that you won't remember me, High Commissioner. I came for your Republic Day reception. There were 2,000. We used to invite everyone.
Sure.
There were 2,000 odd people there, and at that time it was not very significant. But I had to say yes, of course, I remember you, Mr. Minister, very fondly. And so I think these are the tricks of the trade, but there are costs attached to it because in our neighborhood, if you reach out to one party, then the other party feels that you're against them. It happens in Nepal. It happens in Sri Lanka. I'm sure it happens in Bangladesh. Bangladesh is a classic example. Yes. But I don't believe that we did not reach out to the other parties there. But we are accused of supporting only one party. And to some extent we did because, Sheikh Hasina took care of our security concerns, which is very important.
Yeah, exactly. In fact, she delivered on almost all the promises as far as counter-terrorism cooperation is concerned during her time in power. And obviously India said, okay, it's a good run, let's continue with it as far as possible, as long as possible. So that, I suppose, is the tightrope walk that you're talking about. And I think the diplomats do a fairly good job in trying to keep India's interest always protected, no matter where you are.
Sometimes you become unpopular because of that,
exactly.
But that's the price you pay.
That's the price you pay, exactly. So I think that probably sums up the challenge that India has in the neighborhood. Any big country, I suppose, in its own backyard is always facing these problems. You look at US, it's got problems with Canada and Mexico. You go to Australia, they say, the Pacific Island countries are constantly carping about how Australia is being overbearing. And you look at Russia and Central Asia. I think so India also has to be aware of that, I suppose. But fascinating conversation, Yash Sinha. Thank you very much for your time and your insights.
Thank you very much. Thank you for having me. Thank you.
Keep watching Strat News Global. You know where to reach us. Your feedback is extremely important. And we'll bring to you such long format, serious and informative discussions. Don't go away. For the time being, it's goodbye.